It all began with a piece of paper that would forever alter the course of my life: the cancer diagnosis. I still remember the moment I sat in the sterile doctor's office, nervously clutching the edges of the report. The doctor's words blurred together as she spoke, but I couldn't focus on anything except the reality that was settling in: cancer. I felt like I had been struck by lightning, unable to comprehend the full weight of what was unfolding before me. The world around me seemed to spin in slow motion. The silence that followed in the doctor's office felt suffocating. I couldn't find the right words to ask, to make sense of this new reality. I was in shock. How could this be happening to me? How could my life suddenly be defined by this cruel diagnosis? I wanted to scream, to ask for answers, but all I could do was nod numbly as the doctor explained my treatment options. It was like I was hearing the words, but they weren't registering. How do you process something like this? The thought of sharing it with anyone made me feel even more isolated. How could I burden those I loved with such heavy news? How could I ask for help when I wasn't even sure how to help myself? I left the office that day feeling like a different person. The old me, who went about her daily life, carefree, never thinking twice about the future, was gone. In her place was a woman who was now, inexplicably, defined by a disease she hadn't chosen. The diagnosis wasn't just medical, it was a new identity thrust upon me. And I wasn't ready for it. But instead of confronting the truth head-on, I did what many people do when faced with something unbearable. I buried it. I didn't want to admit it to myself, let alone to anyone else. My family, my friends, they didn't need to know. I convinced myself that if I didn't talk about it, if I didn't acknowledge it out loud, maybe it wouldn't be real. So, I hid the report. I tucked it away in a drawer at home, a drawer that I hoped would contain not just the paper, but the feelings of fear, panic, and uncertainty that came with it. A week passed, and life went on. I pretended that everything was normal. I still went to work, still interacted with family, still smiled when I was supposed to. But inside, I was dying. Every day felt like a battle against something I couldn't even see, something that was growing inside me. It was hard to focus on anything else when all I could think about was the silent enemy within. Then came the fateful day. It was a normal Saturday, or so I thought. I was in a rush, trying to finish some work before heading out to run errands. In the midst of the chaos, I left the cancer report on the kitchen counter. It wasn't intentional, but I didn't realize it until I got home hours later. When I walked in, there it was, right where I had left it. I didn't need to look at it to know that it was still sitting there. But it wasn't just the paper that I was worried about. It was the people in my life. I wondered if they had seen it, if they knew what it meant. I couldn't bring myself to ask, but I had a sinking feeling that they did. That night, I tried to bring it up casually over dinner. I said, "Has anyone seen the report I left out on the counter?" My voice felt strained, like I was trying to pretend everything was fine. But the responses were all the same. No, we didn't notice it. It was the kind of answer that felt rehearsed, polite, but distant. No one mentioned the report, not directly, not with concern. It was as though they were avoiding it, pretending it didn't exist. They acted like it was just another piece of mail, nothing worth acknowledging. The weight of that silence hit me hard. I had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that someone would speak up, ask me how I was doing, offer me a moment of vulnerability. But, instead, they pretended not to notice. And in doing so, they had unknowingly deepened the isolation I was already feeling. They didn't want to confront the reality of my illness because, maybe, they didn't know how to. Or maybe it was too hard to admit that someone they loved was facing something so powerful, so uncontrollable. That moment, the moment when they ignored my pain, marked a turning point for me. It was the first time I truly felt invisible in my own life. The people I had always relied on for support were now distant, unwilling to see me in the same way. I wasn't just hiding my cancer diagnosis. I was now hiding from them, pretending that everything was okay when it was far from it. The truth was, I needed them to see me. But they had chosen not to, and that decision, to pretend that nothing had changed, left me in a quiet, suffocating loneliness that was worse than the diagnosis itself. I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending. As the days went on, I found myself sinking deeper into a quiet despair. The diagnosis was no longer a distant worry. It was my reality, looming over me like a dark cloud that I couldn't escape. Every morning I woke up with the same weight pressing down on me. The constant reminder that I was living with something that could take everything from me. But no one could see it. No one could acknowledge it. The world around me continued to turn, and yet I felt like I was standing still, stuck in a place I didn't want to be. I remember the days blending into each other, each one indistinguishable from the last. The mornings were the hardest. I would wake up, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. What did the future hold? Was there time left? I couldn't focus on anything else, the fear of the unknown constantly gnawing at my insides. I would go through the motions of the day, getting out of bed, brushing my teeth, preparing meals, but none of it felt real. I was living in a fog, just going through the motions. Every time I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the person staring back at me. Who was she? The woman who had always been so full of life, who laughed and joked with friends, who had a bright future ahead of her. That woman felt like a stranger now. I wasn't sure who I was anymore, and the more I tried to hold on to that old version of myself, the more it slipped through my fingers. It was a slow burn, the sense of isolation that settled in. At first, I tried to ignore it. I kept up appearances, smiling when I was supposed to, making small talk, pretending everything was okay, but it was exhausting. Pretending to be fine when inside, I was breaking apart, was taking its toll on me. I could feel the emotional strain building, like a pressure cooker that was ready to explode. And the hardest part was that no one could see it. I didn't know how to explain it to them. How could I tell them that every day felt like a battle? How could I make them understand that I needed their support, their empathy? I wanted to scream at them, to shake them and make them see me. But I didn't. I kept my feelings locked away, hiding them behind a facade that grew thinner with each passing day. Even though I longed for someone to notice, to reach out and offer a hand, I couldn't bring myself to ask. It was like I had built an invisible wall around me, one I was too afraid to tear down. What if they didn't care? What if they were just as uncomfortable with my illness as I was? What if my vulnerability became their burden, and they turned away from me in Fear, the thought of rejection paralyzed me. So I withdrew even further, sinking deeper into myself. I stopped attending social gatherings. I didn't answer phone calls from friends. I avoided the people I loved, afraid that they would see through my mask and realize how much I was struggling. It became easier to stay alone, to be in my own company, where no one could ask questions, where no one could see the pain in my eyes. The days began to stretch on, one after the other, and I found myself growing more and more fatigued, physically and emotionally. The fatigue wasn't just from my illness, though. It was from the constant emotional exhaustion of pretending. It was a weight I could no longer carry. I needed help, but I couldn't ask for it. I didn't know how to reach out, to tell someone that I needed them, when I had already convinced myself that no one cared enough to notice. There were moments when I would catch myself wishing that someone, anyone, would just sit with me and ask how I was feeling. But no one did. They carried on with their lives as if nothing had changed. I would overhear casual conversations, and it would hit me like a slap in the face. They don't even know. They don't know the silent battle I'm fighting, the fear that's gnawing at my insides, the loneliness I carry with me every day. They couldn't see what was happening inside me, and in a way, I didn't want them to. I was too afraid of what would happen if they did. In the quiet of the night, when everyone else was asleep, I would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The thoughts would swirl around me, spinning faster and faster, until I felt dizzy. What was the point of it all? Why bother trying to keep going when no one even saw me? I had become invisible, not just to the people around me, but to myself as well. I didn't know how to keep pretending anymore. I didn't know how to keep going on like this. But the fear of what would happen if I stopped pretending was just as overwhelming as the fear of my diagnosis. That fear, that crushing sense of isolation, became the new normal for me. And with each day that passed, the world felt like it was getting smaller, closing in around me. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep going like this. Something had to change, but I didn't know where to begin. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I finally made the decision. I had been weighing it for days, maybe even weeks. But it wasn't until that moment that I knew I had to do it. I had to leave. The weight of living in a constant state of emotional and physical exhaustion had become unbearable. I was suffocating in my own home, trapped by the silence of my illness and the indifference of those around me. Every room in the house felt heavy with unspoken words and unanswered questions. My family and friends continued to go about their lives, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I had tried, in vain, to make them see me, to make them understand that I was struggling, but their refusal to acknowledge it had pushed me into a corner. I could no longer pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't. I needed space, a break from the suffocating walls of my own life. I needed to breathe again. The idea of leaving had been nagging at me for some time, like a whisper in the back of my mind. But each time I thought about it, I pushed it aside. How could I leave? What would they think? Would they understand? Would they even care? But the longer I stayed, the more desperate I became. I realized that if I didn't leave, now I would never get the chance to heal. I was at a crossroads, stay in a place where I felt invisible, alone, and unheard, or take a leap into the unknown, where I could finally confront my reality on my own terms. So, I packed my bags in the middle of the night, quietly, so no one would notice. It felt strangely liberating, like I was finally taking control of my life again. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was making a decision that was entirely mine. I wasn't doing it for anyone else. I was doing it for me. I booked a room at a luxury resort by the beach, a place far away from the city, from the noise, from the people who didn't see me. It was the kind of place I had always dreamed of visiting but never had the courage to. I had never taken a vacation by myself before. But this wasn't a vacation. It wasn't a getaway from work or a chance to relax. It was my escape, my chance to reconnect with myself, to find peace in a world that had suddenly become overwhelming. The resort was set on the edge of a sprawling coastline, where the ocean met the sky in a seamless horizon. It was beautiful, tranquil, and most importantly, it was mine. I didn't have to explain myself to anyone. No one would look at me with pity. No one would avoid the subject of my diagnosis. And for the first time in a long time, I could just exist without the weight of my illness hanging over me. The drive there was surreal. As I passed through the city, I looked at the familiar places, the shops, the parks, the houses, and realized how little I truly belonged in any of them anymore. It felt like I was leaving behind a life that no longer fit, a life that had been swallowed up by my diagnosis and the emotional isolation it brought. I felt the bittersweet pang of leaving behind my home, but I also felt the lightness that came with the idea of a fresh start, even if it was just for a few days. When I arrived at the resort, I checked in and made my way to my room. The room was spacious and airy, with large windows that offered a panoramic view of the beach. The bed was soft, the linens pristine, and the atmosphere calm, like it had been designed specifically for someone who needed to escape. I threw my bags onto the bed and stood by the window, staring out at the vast ocean. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, to take in the serenity around me. I spent the next few days in quiet solitude. I took long walks along the beach, letting the cool water wash over my feet. I watched the sunset every evening, marveling at the beauty of the colors as they melted into the sky. Each day, I felt a little more like myself, like the person I had been before everything changed. It wasn't easy. The thoughts of my family, of my illness, would creep into my mind, and I would push them away. But being in this place, surrounded by nature and peace, allowed me to think in a way I hadn't been able to in months. I began to realize that I couldn't keep living for others, pretending that everything was fine. I needed to take care of myself, to honor my own feelings, to accept that it was okay to be vulnerable and to seek healing in my own way. On the third evening, as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, a quiet thought crossed my mind. What if this was what I needed? All along, a break from the pressure, a chance to heal both physically and emotionally, a space where I could come to terms with what was happening to me, without the judgment or the silence. It was in this moment, alone with the vastness of the ocean, that I made a promise to myself. I would face my diagnosis head-on, but I would do it on my terms. And when I was ready, I would return home, not as the woman who had hidden behind her illness, but as someone who had learned to live with it, to accept it, and to be seen. It was a Tuesday evening, and the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the tranquil beach. The resort was quiet, save for the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the shore. I had been enjoying the peace, the solitude, but a part of me felt an odd sense of emptiness. As much as I relished the serenity, there was something missing. Something, or someone to share it with. But I quickly dismissed that thought, reminding myself that I had come here for myself, to heal, and not for the company of others. I was sitting on a lounge chair, wrapped in a light sweater against the cool evening air, watching the sea and the sky blend together in a beautiful haze. I felt calm, peaceful, but also strangely distant from everything that had brought me here. My diagnosis was still there, in the back of my mind. But it felt easier to breathe with each passing day. It was the space I needed. I had begun to understand that sometimes healing isn't just about fighting the illness. It's also about finding the strength to let go, to give yourself permission to rest and to live in the moment, even when the future seems uncertain. I was lost in these thoughts when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, half expecting to see one of the resort staff members or another guest. But when I looked up, my heart skipped a beat. There, standing in front of me, was Olivia, my sister. Her face was a mixture of apprehension and determination, and she looked as though she had been through a great deal just to get here. Olivia! My voice cracked as I spoke, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. How did she find me here? What was she doing here? I hadn't expected anyone to visit, not for at least a few more weeks, not until I was ready. But there she stood, her eyes searching mine as if she were trying to understand what had brought me to this point. She took a few hesitant steps forward, looking down at the sand as if unsure whether to sit down beside me or not. I didn't know how to find you, she began, her voice shaky. But I had to. I've been trying to reach you for days. I had to see you. The air around us seemed to still as she spoke, and for a moment I couldn't find the words. The mix of emotions running through me was overwhelming. Part of me wanted to run to her, to hug her, to apologize for leaving without a word. But another part of me, the part that had been hiding away from the world, felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I wasn't sure I was ready for. "What are you doing here?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you come?" Olivia hesitated before she answered, and when she did, her words hit me like a wave crashing onto the shore. "I saw your report," she said, her voice breaking. "The one you left out. The cancer report." She paused, searching my eyes for any sign that I had known she'd seen it. I should have said something when I saw it. I should have acknowledged it, but I didn't know how. I didn't know what to say. And now, I don't know how to make up for it. A silence stretched between us, a silence filled with the weight of unspoken things. I could see the guilt in her eyes, but also a deep concern that she hadn't shown me before. I had spent weeks, maybe months, convincing myself that no one cared. I had isolated myself, convinced that the people around me would never understand, that they would never really see me. And yet, here was Olivia, standing before me, acknowledging my pain in a way I had longed for but never thought would come. "I didn't want you to feel like a burden," I finally said, my voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want to put That on you. I didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable. So I hid it. I thought if I didn't talk about it, no one would have to face it. I didn't want to be that person, the one who makes everything about the sickness. Olivia shook her head, her face a mask of regret. You're not a burden. You were never a burden. And I should have known that. Should have been there for you? But instead, I pretended like everything was fine. I was afraid, too. Afraid of what it would mean to face it, to face you, to admit that I didn't know how to help. Her voice trembled. I'm so sorry. Hearing her apology, seeing the raw emotion in her eyes was more than I had expected. It was everything I had wanted but had been too afraid to ask for. And in that moment, I realized that I had been wrong all along. My fear of burdening others had kept me from seeing that they too were carrying the weight of my diagnosis in their own way. They didn't know how to help, just like I didn't. But that didn't mean they didn't care. We sat together in silence, the only sound the soft whispers of the waves crashing against the shore. It was a silence that spoke volumes, one filled with understanding and connection, the kind of connection I had been searching for but hadn't known how to find. I'm here now, Olivia said softly, breaking the silence. And I'm not going anywhere. I want to be here for you, whatever you need. Tears welled in my eyes as I finally let myself breathe. I had been so afraid to let anyone in, so afraid that they wouldn't understand. But Olivia's presence reminded me that there was still love, still the possibility of healing, even when everything seemed lost. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel so alone. The following days felt like a blur of conversations, emotions, and revelations. Olivia stayed with me at the resort, her presence bringing a warmth and familiarity I hadn't realized I'd been craving. It felt surreal, in the best way possible, to have someone truly there, not just physically, but emotionally. We spent hours talking, each conversation peeling back the layers of silence I had so carefully built around myself. Every word she spoke, every apology and every shared laugh allowed me to begin the healing process I had so desperately needed. But beneath the surface, the cancer diagnosis still lingered, like an invisible shadow that neither of us could ignore. It was impossible to pretend it didn't exist anymore, even with all the love and support Olivia was offering me. I had spent so long running from the truth, pretending it wasn't there, that I had forgotten how to confront it head-on. But Olivia's presence was a stark reminder that avoiding the truth only made it harder to move forward. It was time to face what I had been avoiding. One evening, after a long day of sitting by the beach and talking, Olivia gently broached the subject that had been hanging between us like an unspoken truth. You know, you don't have to do this alone, she said quietly, her voice full of tenderness. I know you've kept everything to yourself, but I think it's time we face it together. I can help. We can figure this out. Her words felt like a lifeline thrown in my direction, but I hesitated. I had been so used to carrying the weight of my illness alone, so conditioned to thinking that I didn't need anyone, that the idea of leaning on someone else seemed almost foreign. But Olivia was right. I had to stop isolating myself, stop thinking that I had to do everything on my own. The burden I was carrying was too heavy for one person to bear. It was time to share, to finally let someone in. I've been so afraid, I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper, afraid that if I tell people, if I let them see how weak I really am, they'll leave. I thought if I kept quiet, if I didn't burden anyone with the truth, I wouldn't have to see their disappointment. I didn't want anyone to see me as someone who needed help. Olivia's eyes softened with understanding, and she gently took my hand. "I'm not going anywhere," she assured me. "I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to help you fight this, however long it takes." Her words were like a balm to a wound I hadn't even realized was still raw. It was amazing how much weight could be lifted by someone simply being present, by someone who understood that my struggle wasn't about weakness, but about survival. I wasn't weak for needing help. I was human, and that was enough. The next morning, we sat down together, and I finally spoke the words that had been trapped inside me for so long. "I have cancer," I said, my voice trembling as I said it, out loud for the first time. "I don't know what to do. I don't know what happens next, but I can't keep pretending I'm okay." Saying it aloud was both a relief and a shock. It felt like I had lifted a massive weight off my shoulders, but also like I had just opened a door I couldn't close. Olivia didn't say anything at first. She simply hugged me, holding me tightly as I let the tears I had been holding back for so long finally fall. I had been so afraid of admitting the truth to myself and to others, but in that moment, I realized that it wasn't the truth itself that was hard. It was the fear of facing it alone. As we sat there, the weight of my diagnosis slowly began to settle into a new understanding. I wasn't fighting this alone anymore. Olivia was here, and she wasn't going anywhere. And together, we could face whatever came next. The journey ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, I felt like I wasn't walking it in silence. The days that followed, Olivia helped me begin the process of figuring out my treatment options. She was with me every step of the way, asking the questions I couldn't bring myself to ask, scheduling appointments, and sitting beside me as I began to make decisions about my future. It wasn't easy. The uncertainty of the future was still there, lurking in the background. But it didn't feel as overwhelming now that I had someone to share it with. The truth I had been avoiding for so long wasn't something to fear. It was something I needed to confront, for my own peace of mind, for my own healing. And while the future was still uncertain, one thing was clear. I wasn't alone in this fight. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe I couldn't control everything, but I could control how I faced it. And I would face it with the people I loved by my side. It had been weeks since Olivia had first arrived at the resort, and the changes in me were undeniable. When I first stepped foot on that beach, I had been lost, gripped by fear, by a sense of isolation, and by a desperate need to escape. The diagnosis was more than just a physical condition. It had become my entire world. But now, things were different. I was beginning to understand that it was not just the illness I had to face, but the fear and loneliness I had built up around it. The healing I had been searching for didn't come quickly or easily. The journey was slow, and each day was a new battle, not just against the illness, but against the emotional barriers I had erected to protect myself. Yet, with Olivia by my side, the process had started to feel less like an impossible task. Every conversation we had, every laugh we shared, every moment of quiet reflection on the beach had gradually begun to rebuild the parts of me I thought were lost forever. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was slowly learning how to live again. One evening, as we sat by the resort's quiet pool, sipping tea under the dim light of the lanterns, Olivia looked at me and asked a question that I hadn't dared to think about until then. "So, what's next?" she asked gently. "Have you thought about what you want to do when you go back home?" The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on the present moment, so caught up in my own healing, and the peace the resort had given me, that I hadn't really thought about the future. I had been afraid to think about the future. After all, the future seemed so uncertain. The cancer, the treatment, the fear. It all felt like a never-ending cycle. But as I looked at Olivia, the woman who had stood by me through everything, I realized that thinking about the future wasn't something to be afraid of. The future was a series of steps, small ones at first, that I could take, one day at a time. I wasn't bound by my diagnosis. I could still choose to live. "I'm not sure," I admitted, staring into my tea as if the answer would appear there. "But I do know one thing. I want to live. I want to fight this, but I also want to live a life that doesn't just revolve around the cancer. I want to be present, to enjoy the things I've been missing. I want to be seen, not just as the person with cancer, but as who I really am." Olivia smiled, her eyes filled with pride and love. "You already are," she said softly. "You've always been that person. I think you just needed to remind yourself." Her words struck a chord deep within me. In all the time I had spent hiding, avoiding the truth, I had forgotten who I really was. I had become so consumed by my illness and by the fear of it that I had lost sight of the person I had always been before all of this. I wasn't just someone who had cancer. I was someone who had dreams, who had a life to live, and who was worthy of love and joy. The diagnosis didn't define me. It was simply a part of my story, a chapter that I would face with courage, but not one that would be my entire narrative. Over the next few days, I started making small decisions about the future. I began to research treatment options more actively, working with Olivia to set up consultations and make appointments with specialists. I also reached out to some of my closest friends, reconnecting with them in a way I hadn't been able to before. The walls I had built around myself were slowly coming down, brick by brick. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I felt overwhelmed by the weight of what was still to come. But I had learned not to let fear control me anymore. One of the biggest decisions I made was to return home and face my family. I had avoided them for months, afraid of their pity, afraid of their discomfort with my illness. But I knew I couldn't keep hiding from them forever. I needed them. And they needed to see that I wasn't just my diagnosis. I was still their daughter, their sister, their friend. And I wanted to be present in their lives, to continue to be a part of their world, even if it meant being vulnerable. The night before we left the resort, I stood by the window, looking out at the ocean one last time. The place that had been my escape had also become my sanctuary, a place where I could heal and rediscover myself. It had given me the strength to face the future, to embrace the uncertainty that lay ahead. I wasn't sure what that future held, but I knew I was ready to meet it. As I packed my bags, Olivia came into the room and sat beside me. "You're stronger than you think," she said softly. "You've already done the hardest part. You've let yourself feel, Let yourself be vulnerable. The rest is just walking forward, one step at a time. And that was exactly what I intended to do. One step at a time.